Hello, this is your host Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, episode 36 of the Church Fathers with Logos. We're here to read chapters 121 to 130 of the dialogue with Trypho. So, chapter 121, the Christians are the fulfillment of the Davidic prophecy that through his own seed the nations, the Gentiles, would be blessed. Well, men used to worship the Son. Nobody died for the Son, S-U-N. Christ died for the Son of God. Christ is called, his name is the East. In Zechariah, Christ comes in two advents. If in his first advent he redeemed the Gentiles, defeated the demons, and his death to this day strikes fear into the powers of this world, just imagine what his second advent will bring about. Okay, 122. The words of David do not refer to strangers and proselytes as the Jews think, but to Christ and his followers. Justin makes reference to Moses and Isaiah to show that they were prophecies that non-Jews would eventually be brought to faith. Proselytes like you Jews persecute Christians and blaspheme Christ's name. Justin argues that Trypho must admit that God prophesied a new covenant, and such prophecies of David's seed and salvation of the nations must refer to this new covenant. Christ's inheritance is the nations. Okay, 123. The proselytes have no need of a covenant, since they are the same as the Jews with circumcision and law-keeping. They are not a new thing. The Gentile converts to Judaism do not constitute the law of God going to all the nations. Furthermore, you Jews have provoked God's wrath by your behavior and constantly breaking his law. Their prophecies that the Jews will be taken from the land and that the Jews will be mingled with beasts. Justin quotes Isaiah as saying, in a further day, the Assyrians and Egyptians, like the Jews, will be children of God. Okay, so there's a lot there. Do you have anything you want to add on these first three chapters, Logos?
Yeah, when I first saw that part about nobody dying worshiping the sun, the first thing I thought of was the Old Testament and how lots of countries were, basically genocided, for lack of a better term, for worshiping different gods and doing things that God didn't like. Canaanite, Sodom, Gomorrah, so on and so forth. I mean, ostensibly, God probably could have reached out an olive branch and told these people to stop doing it. Well, they didn't stop doing it. They wanted to worship whatever they were worshiping the way they were doing it, and they died for it. So I don't know. I mean, maybe it should have said nobody ever, martyred themselves for worshiping the sun in some really specific sense. But it seems people die for false beliefs quite often.
I think that's probably what he meant. Let's see if we can find the actual statement here. He said, son. Can't seem to. I think it's in 121, but I can't seem to find it here. But I think what you're talking about, Logos, is what Justin is talking about is probably martyrdom in the sense of preaching about the sun and then dying for it, I guess. Was there anything else? Because I know there's some inside baseball with Jews and Christians here for other things. I don't know if you need any clarification or any questions.
I mean, assume I only understand about 20 to 30% of whatever I read in any given passage. I mean, that's probably a fair assumption. One thing I did gather over the first early chapters is that a lot, again, seems to be writing on Mary being of David's lineage. If for some reason that's false, a lot of this stuff seems to be pretty questionable.
Yeah. Well, yeah, exactly. Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, I didn't see any issue with 123. That one was pretty straightforward.
Okay. I also have some more notes here. Trypho asks, were the Christians the new Israel? Justin discounts that Trypho is ignorant of the answer. He thinks he's asking this for the sake of his Jewish friends. Justin cites Isaiah 42, 1-4 to make that claim. Okay, now we're in 124. Justin perceives that the Jews were perplexed at the Christians being called the sons of God. Justin quotes Psalm 82, where it is stated that those who received the law were as gods. Satan, knowing this, tempted Adam and Eve by promising to make them gods. This led to their deaths, whereas the truth of Christ leads to life. So what Justin is saying here is that it's the idea that Adam and Eve would have become like gods was true, but it was not true if they did it in the way that Satan offered them a shortcut. The idea would be that it would happen by following the law or by following God's teachings. And so that's sort of, and he's using Psalm 82 for that.
Now, this one I did have a question on 24. Let's go back for a second. I can't help but look at, this sons of God terminology and Christ being the Son of God, and wonder if these are in some sense synonymous.
Yeah. So we have, let's see. Does this bring up a new page for us to look at? Okay, this is Psalm 82. God standeth in the congregation of the mighty. He judges among the gods. And then if we go down, I have said in verse 6, I have said, ye are gods, and all ye are children of the Most High. And it's really verse 6 here that Justin's zeroing in on.
Yeah. So, and I think Christ kind of echoes this in the New Testament. I don't remember which verse it's been, or it was, since it's been a while since I've read it, but he says, like, he performs some kind of a miracle and people are like, going crazy over it. And he just says, even the least among you can do what I have done.
Right.
That seems to be the entire point here. There's something that's it's not like Christ is some, I don't know, like some avatar or some demiurgic being that's apart from us. It seems to be what these are trying to convey. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong about this, is that we're all meant to be Christ-like in all the relevant senses.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, there's like two senses, right? Christ in his moral perfection, but then also Christ in his power.
Right.
And of course, there's this, in one sense, right, with the Acts of the Apostles, the idea is that the apostles can do all this. And okay, so this is an interesting question, right, Logos? Because there's a big debate that's been going on since the 80s between spiritual gifts and what's called cessationism, which is the idea that spiritual gifts have stopped. And I don't know what that's within Protestant circles. I don't know if that goes on within Catholic or Orthodox, but the idea is that, Pentecostals be like, yeah, it's happening all the time. Look at our churches. And people are like, whoa, it's a little crazy. No, it doesn't happen at all. And any sort of middle position seems to get squeezed out, though it technically exists on paper. It's not the most numerous.
Yeah. I mean, the empirical questions about whether people are regularly walking on water or turning water into wine aside, I just think the ontological question of what exactly is Jesus as a member of the Trinity is pretty interesting, because if we're all meant to be sons of God in the sense that Jesus is, do successful Christians like add the Trinity in some relevant sense, because there's like a Christ 1, a Christ 2, a Christ 3, and like as a collection you're all a son of God?
No. So the idea would be more like Christ is this template, but it's a template that we can't live to by ourselves. He has to help us reach that level. So maybe to re-put it another way, it's a lowercase g used to the word God here. So there's a kind of elevated status that was meant for man. We read in the Psalms and elsewhere that man is a little lower than the angels. The idea being that, well, if you're higher than the angels, what are you? You're a lowercase g God then. And that lowercase g God, which, you could say the demons were LARPing as in the Olympian pantheon, is what we were meant to be. And Adam and Eve deviated badly from that by being seduced by Satan's shortcut.
Yeah, I get that, but here's the interesting question. So the Son, as a member of the Trinity, is caused and sustained by the Father. So if the Father is capital G God sustaining the lower two of the Trinity, it seems to me that the lower two of the Trinity are lowercase gods as well.
Well, they're not lowercase gods in the sense of lowercase g gods in the sense of, say, the gods of Olympus, or what Adam and Eve were intended to become, because it's a subtle distinction, but it's an important one. The Son and the Spirit, there was never a time when they were not, because they both necessarily proceed from the Father, whereas man was created at some point time t.
I guess that's true.
So there's two ways you can be dependent upon God for your existence, right? You can be what the councils have called a sort of like an essential emanation, which would be the Son and the Holy Spirit, or you could be something that is created that is then actively Okay, so we're kind of getting ahead a little bit, and maybe I can say more when we get to 128.
Oh,
But
sure. Yeah.
imagine this distinction, okay? Because Justin does use the idea of the sun or a candle and light. As long as the sun is burning, there's always light coming from the sun, right? Or as long as the candle is burning, there's always light coming from the candle. And as soon as you snuff out the candle, the light goes away. It's coterminous with the source, right?
Yes.
It's if the source is there, it's necessarily there, even though it's dependent on the source. But if the source be God the Father, who's eternal, then this is an eternal effect necessarily.
Right.
Whereas man is like a property that's being maintained. So, we exist, God sustains our existence, but it's more in the sense that it's a garden or a property that's being maintained by some sort of, steward. So we're both dependent on God the Father, but in very different ways.
Okay. Yeah, we'll definitely talk about this more in chapter 128, because there's a really interesting verbiage there that I want to talk about as well.
Right. Yeah. So I know we're getting ahead a little bit, but I think that's the distinction I'd want to make here. Okay. 125. Justin explains the meaning in the name of Israel and hopes that, like the sower from Christ's parable, he finds good ground in these men. He argues that Israel is a compound word, Israel, which means a man overcoming, and El, which means God. A man overcoming God. Jacob wrestled with God, and the serpent tempted Christ to worship him as God. Christ rebuked Satan, saying, "You shall worship God alone." The pain of Christ's life was foreshadowed in the pain of Jacob's suffering and the shrinking of his thigh. All who flee to God the Father through Jacob will find rest. Justin argues that the Jews fail to understand this because they are the carnal seed of Jacob, but not the spiritual seed. So one thing that I want to bring up and show on the screen is with his Old Testament, I think Justin isn't quite always on the ball. So if we look at the exegetical guide here for Israel, using the name Israel, it's going to take a little while to load up, using the dictionary of the Old Testament, we see that it's not quite as he makes it. I mean, it's close enough, but just have to wait a little bit. There we go. So look at Israel. Then we look at the TDOT, the Dictionary of Old Testament. Etymology. Yeah. So the Theophorus element is not object, but the subject of the phrase name. And since El is probably not an appelet, but the name of the god El, Israel must mean like El strives or El contends. Altering this interpretation somewhat by taking the imperfect as a narrative tense and translating the name referring to the past. So, I mean, it's close, but it's not quite.
That's really interesting that El contends is one of the possible translations for Israel, because one of the founding myths of Israel is God or Jacob wrestling with God.
Yeah. Okay, 127. When we read that God met Abraham, or that God came down to behold the Tower of Babel, or that God shut Noah in the ark, that God the Father did these, not that God the Father did these things. God the Father remains in his own place. No man could look at Moses' face when he came down the mountain, who would only talk to God the Father, not even seeing him. Since no man can see God and live, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob must have seen the Son of God. If we are taking a different reading, then God the Father must have left heaven, which nobody would want to say that. So let's see. Oh, that is 127. Okay, now we're at 128. The Old Testament theophanies to Abraham, Moses, and Joshua are of Christ, or the Logos, not the Father. Christ is called an angel in some cases because he was acting as a messenger. The power, Christ, is unrepresented from the Father, as light is inescapable from the Son. A power can spring forth from and return to the Father at will. Justin also thinks the angels were made this way. Some angels, Christ, are never made this way and always existed and never reduced to the form from which they sprang. The Son was begotten by the Father, not as though it was through division, as if God could be divided, but as light shines from a kindled fire. Yeah, this is what you wanted to talk about, Logo, so have at it.
So the interesting thing here is the discussion of substance, right? He's begotten of the Father substance. Now, when I saw that phrase, my brain immediately went back to the streams that you and I went on about how to account for the ontology of creation. So one model could be creation ex nihilo, but that didn't sit well with us because even God himself, I don't think, can truly pull something from nothing. So the interpretation of that would be God creates out of nothing aside from himself. And so really that gets to a view where which people just call creation ex dio. God creates from himself to basically make it a little bit easier for people to understand. But if God creates everything out of his own substance, then I don't know what it's supposed to signify that Christ is out of God's substance, because everything is.
Well, that's a kind of panentheism or pantheism. If I don't remember, I know we did like 5 videos together going over some Christian themes, but the position I hold to is creation ex nihilo. But early on in the apology, it seems like Justin was creation ex materia.
I think where that really came up was when talking about the Greek myths. This is one of the apologies, I think, where he was talking about how the lowercase g Greek gods made some girl pregnant. And I think the thing was a question of whether there was like a material they used to do it. I think Justin thinks that God always, yeah, now I remember, yeah. Justin would have God being creation ex materia. So God only creates out of physically existing material stuff. Then there's creation ex dio, where God creates out of himself. And there's like some kind of creation ex nihilo, which would say that God could actually just pull something from nothing because he's just that powerful.
Right. But here's the thing, right? If we're going to see, this is, well, I guess, let me read directly what Justin says, because it's actually kind of dense. He says, let's see, where do we want to start? Yeah. Because he appears arrayed in such forms as the Father pleases, and they call him the Word because he carried tidings from the Father to men, but maintain that this power is indivisible and inseparable from the Father, just as they say that the light of the sun on earth is indivisible and inseparable from the sun in the heavens, as when it sinks, the light sinks along with it. So the Father, when he chooses, says that they cause his power to spring forth, and when he chooses, he makes it return to himself. And this way they teach he made the angels. Now, it sounds like he's saying Moses, Abraham, and Jacob taught that, but they didn't. I mean, I've read the Old Testament a lot, and they never say that. So, again, Justin is on some funny ground with the Old Testament again.
Yeah, it feels like he's kind of forced into saying it, right? Because if you look at creation, all the physical stuff around us, Justin seems to have the idea implicitly from the other dialogues we've talked about that God is doing everything he does to existing matter. He's kind of like the ultimate Platonic painter, painting on an existing canvas with existing paints. But then what are you to make of Christ and angels and stuff like that? So the substance thing for Justin actually makes sense. There's everything that exists that God paints with, and then there's God himself, which is everything else, Christ, angels, and all that. So it's like the essence energies distinction, where everything that's not physical but yet is manipulated by God to be observable by us is just a manifestation of his energies. But where that's really interesting is Christ then on this model, the Son of God, he wants to claim Christ as a distinct person, but he set him up ontologically just to be another aspect of God's energy.
Well, he makes this distinction further, but it is proved that there are angels who always existed and are never reduced to that form out of which they sprang. So it sounds like he's saying that when the angels are sent forth, they're not having an independent existence until they're sent forth. And then they return back to God, which is a very strange way of describing angels.
Right.
And then he's saying, but Jesus is a different kind of angel in that he's an angel that doesn't fall back into the divine essence and is always independent. And I'm like, well, wait, I don't think angels are a part of the divine essence.
I mean, the whole Lucifer uprising wouldn't make sense if the angels were a part of the divine essence, right? The
No.
second they tried to rebel, God just says, "Okay, back in the closet," snaps his fingers, they all go back to the divine essence. Like, we'll try again when you guys can behave yourself, you know?
Well, that's the thing, right? Because let's read Justin again, right? He says he makes it return to himself. So they have no independent existence unless they're on a mission. But what mission could they possibly be on for Satan to rebel? Because there's no created world yet.
Exactly. And just internally, Justin's model doesn't make sense because the angels are of the divine essence, and this is how they are. They're not independent. They come back when they're done. But Christ is also of the divine essence, but he's supposed to be a distinct person. So what exactly is it ontologically on Justin's model that makes
Uh-huh.
Christ this distinct person that isn't true of the angels, like say Lucifer, who are supposed to be distinct people?
Right. Well, again, yeah, and then he says, and that this power which the prophetic word calls God has been also amply demonstrated in angels, not numbered as different in name only like the light of the sun, but is indeed something numerically distinct. You're right. That's why he made that thing about the light going on and off, because if you hide the sun sets, the light of the sun goes away, so that would be the angels going back in the closet. But
Mm-hmm.
that doesn't happen with Christ because he's always this distinct numerical person. And I'm like, you're losing me here, Justin.
Yeah, this whole model doesn't make any sense at all.
I have discussed briefly in When It's Gone before when I assert that this power was begotten from the Father by his power and will, but not by abscission, as if the essence of the Father was divided, as all other things partitioned and divided are not the same after as before they were divided. And for the sake of example, I took the case of fires kindled from a fire, which we see to be distinct from it, and yet that from which many can be kindled is by no means made less, but remain the same. 128 is just kind of a mess. It's completely impenetrable.
It is, yeah.
It's like, wow, this is well. And again, he says, and to say that the power sent forth some from the Father of all which appeared to Moses or to Abraham or to Jacob is called an angel, became because he came to men, is called glory because he appears in the vision. Okay. Well, okay, maybe he's not saying that Moses, Abraham, and Jacob are saying these things. He's mentioning Moses, Abraham, and Jacob because they saw the second person of the Trinity, and he's
Right.
just appealing to his own position. But his own position doesn't make sense. Angels are not a part of the divine essence.
Right.
Because see, well, who is the they? In this way, they teach. Who's the they? Is that Moses, Abraham, and Jacob? Is it philosophers? Like there
Is
aren't
it
that many.
just the Old Testament scriptures?
Would have to be right because he's not referring to the New Testament and he's not
Yeah.
referring to philosophers or even Christians.
Yep.
But nowhere in the Old Testament do we read anything remotely like that angels are from the divine essence.
Mm-mm.
So again, Justin's Old Testament here is kind of bad. I also skipped over 126 by accident. Let me read that. Christ is called by many names: an angel, a man by Ezekiel, the Son of Man by Daniel, a child by Isaiah, Christ and God by David, a stone by many, wisdom by Solomon, Joseph and Judah, and a star by Moses, and the east by Zechariah, the suffering one, and Jacob and Israel by Isaiah again, a rod and a flower, and a cornerstone, and the Son of God. If you understand the prophets, you would have understood Christ. Jacob wrestled with God, seeing him face to face. Abraham and Sarah were visited by Christ, who told them Sarah would conceive and Sodom would be destroyed. Okay, now we're at 129. Let's see. That the divine being is not numerical one, but at least two, is shown in all the Old Testament theophanies, when it is said Adam has become like us. Justin argues that the us means plurality. Right. So, yeah, if anybody wants to say that in Genesis, when God says, we'll make man in our own image, it obviously can't include angels or what is more broadly called the heavenly council, which some people want to say, because man is not made in the image of angels or other divine things. Man is made in the image of God.
Yeah, when I heard people talk about that verse, they always talk about the Elohim, which is supposed to be like this council of all sorts of gods, of which El was just a singular member. And they think about the story of Israel as a story of a bunch of different tribes worshiping different members of this pantheon, and one of them kind of winning.
Yeah, that's actually the least parsimonious interpretation. The most parsimonious interpretation, I guess, would be the royal we, which I think the Jew would appeal to, because the Jew wouldn't want to have a multiple godhead.
Right.
Okay, lastly, 130. Christ will come and rule in judgment and power, Deuteronomy 32:43. The nations will rejoice with the people of Israel, Isaiah 66:24. God is angry at the Jews for their sins. Christ is the new Jacob, and hence the new Israel. And the members of the new Israel of the believer are the believer Gentiles. Israel disobeyed God with his idolatry, but God has shown mercy on the Gentiles who repented from idol worship. So, one of the things that's really strange about some of these speculations we get from Justin, the creation ex materia, which he then kind of contradicts with his own teaching about angels. I don't know. What do you think, Logos, of this idea? That there's just some guy just wanted to edit it to be some sort of not in the sense of editing Ignatius in order to prove Catholic doctrines before they could have historically developed, but more like just some sort of agent provocateur trickster who's like, let's just add all this weird stuff to Justin and see if anybody notices.
I mean, given the stuff we saw from Justin's other dialogues and the way he plays fast and loose with philosophy, I don't think anybody had to edit Justin to kind of make this stuff happen. I mean, I think given what Justin professes of himself, that he was a Platonic philosopher and he's making a transition to Christianity, I think he's taking different aspects of the philosophy and trying to make them work similarly to how we see Thomists do it today with, say, Aristotle and God. So he is more of a Timaeus Platonist trying to make Christianity work, as opposed to an Aristotelian making Christianity work via Aristotelian Thomism or something. And so he's just committed himself to a lot of things. So, I mean, in the Timaeus, you have creation ex materia. God is the craftsman. You have this prime matter. God is, implanting the forms on matter to make stuff happen. The pure forms would be the demiurges and so on and so on and so forth. So, if you've already got that view in mind and you're trying to incorporate Christianity into that view, well, that's what gives you creation ex materia right there. So that's just the one-to-one correspondence between the Timaeus and a Christian account of creation. But then you have the demiurges, the people that act out. So in Plato, Zeus, the god of lightning, is just the maximal form of lightning that can be instantiated on physical matter. That's what a demiurge is. That's what Zeus is, so to speak. Okay. Well, how does God, get his will done in the world? Destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, so on and so forth. Oh, okay, well, we have these angels in the Christian story. Those can be like the demiurges from Plato. And once you start mapping him one to one, it's just very, very clear why he thinks some of the things that he thinks.
Well, how would that explain the angels being a part of God's essence?
Well, this is where the Timaeus is really, really weird, because on the one hand, the most powerful versions of, let's say, lightning, let's just use Zeus for an example, right? There is the form of lightning, and anytime we see lightning from any source, that will be a shadow on the wall, Republic, so to speak. You'll never see the true thing, only a shadow on the wall. Well, imagine the very, very best representation that we could ever see. That's what something like Zeus would be. Now, on the one hand, Zeus has to be the maximally participating form, but on the other hand, he has to, in a sense, be a form because of Platonic recollection and how when you die, you go back and hang out with the gods and so on. And so you have this dualistic problem of self-participation, which has been a problem for a lot of Platonic philosophy, where you have forms and you have forms being participatory in reality and not the forms themselves. And that's what the angels are doing here in this. The angels are participating in reality insofar as God needs them for something. He is kind of doing they're doing his will in reality. But when they are not doing his will in reality, they've got to be somewhere. And so being in the divine essence is kind of like the forms being in Platonic heaven when they're not being Zeus doing lightning stuff.
Okay.
Make sense?
No, it does. It does. And that actually So this actually proves, well, I think illustrates a couple of points that I'd like to make. One, you can't. Okay, there's a certain exoteric level at which pagan philosophies have overlap with Christianity. So, like, for example, certain ethical truths, when we read the Credo, I mentioned some of what Plato said sounds vaguely Christian. You can read Aristotle's Ethics and find some stuff that sounds vaguely Christian. But when you get to that like, metaphysics stuff, you just cannot mix these things. It doesn't work.
Right.
And then second of all, we've been at volume 1 for a while. We're probably over halfway through by now. But Irenaeus has a lot to go through, so I don't want to like jinx us. The point being is we've already seen there's like two ways of like reading or teaching scripture. We have like what we might call just by the book Christians. We have like Mathetes and the Didache and some other stuff. And it's pretty straightforward by the numbers. There's no weird stuff. You read it, it's like, yeah, sure, it's fine.
Right.
But then you get this like philosophy woo-woo, like Barnabas, some stuff from Ignatius, which I think we kind of handled well enough.
Sure.
And then Justin kind of is on the fence. Sometimes he's pretty straightforward. Like his account of Christian worship is very, very much indebted to the Didache. It's very simple, very straightforward. And that's no nonsense, no woo-woo. But then he goes in the woo-woo lane because of philosophy. And it's really a lot of these weird, bad ideas come from various philosophical traditions trying to enter into Christianity.
Yep.
Now, that's not to say that this then makes them Gnostics. They're not Gnostics because Gnosticism is like the full judo throw where now you're completely on the other side. And now you're completely reinterpreting the Bible in this new strange way. This is like people just dipping their toes into philosophy, and they get some really weird ideas that they try to bring into the scriptures. But one thing that I thought a lot about is as I read this dialogue, it's almost over. We'll probably finish it next week. Is the sense of which, the deja vu that I get. Justin is frustrated with the Jewish audience for not getting on board with the evidence. And not that I debate Jews, but I debate other Christians. And yeah, I feel very similar to the way Justin feels. And in 2 Corinthians 3, Paul says this about the Jews, but their minds were blinded, for until this day, the same veil remains unlifted in the reading of the Old Testament because the veil is taken away in Christ. But even to this day, when Moses is read, a veil lies on their heart. So what Paul is saying is that the Jews, you can read the Old Testament in like one way in which you don't see this higher purpose that God has towards the Messiah, or at least the Messiah as the Christians believe he actually came. And then there's the sense in which if you have the Christian perspective, you can read it and then find it correctly. But what I've noticed is, because of Olgos, I've obviously, I've complained to you a lot about people not following the facts when you lay it before them. It's almost like there's another veil. There's like a veil that lies over so-called professing Christians who read the New Testament, and you can point them to these passages and make these open and shut cases that just don't stick, and they might as well be Trypho, ignoring what's being said about the theophanies of Christ. And I think one of the things that I've kind of seen with this is that there's almost like two veils, right? There's one veil which is we're a part of a tradition. And so, like, if you're a first century Jew coming out of the rabbinical tradition, which is about 200 years old at this point, it's going to be hard to see anything else. So if you come out of these traditions like Lutheran, Catholic, Orthodox, Anglican, it's going to be hard to come out. And so you're not going to be able to see these things. And then also the hyper reality of it all, right? These denominations, some have been around for over 1,000 years, some for hundreds. And there's just so much overlay of, it's all Talmudic, right? Commentaries on commentaries. You sort of lose sight of it. Do you sort of see what I'm getting at, Logos, with this idea of a veil?
Yeah.
So what it seems like that what we have now is like another layer of the veil, not just the one on the Jews who can't read the Old Testament, but now we have Christians that can't read the New. And I think what this ties into is a claim that you and I have been touching on a lot recently and throughout the whole series. You read everything about Christianity now, and all of a sudden, it's a complete flip when Constantine comes to power. I think that's when the veil comes.
Hey, we'll see if it happens a little bit earlier. I mean, that'll be interesting to look at. We're inching our way closer and closer to him.
Right. I mean, yeah, I'm sure there's going to be people that fumble the ball in the lead up, right? You don't go from, faithfulness to complete apostasy overnight, but it is interesting how. But would you agree though that this is a similar kind of analogy? There's this veil where you just can't see what's there.
Uh, yeah, I mean, absolutely. This is why I'm kind of a Veblen fan for economics, right? Like supply and demand don't exist in a vacuum. They exist in a context of like cultural presuppositions, traditions, all sorts of things you're implicitly taught to value, and all sorts of other very irrational things that kind of subtly weigh in on what should be economic rationality, so to speak, which is why Veblen always chuckled at the term, rational self-interest or whatever, because most of our decision-making process we just don't do in this hyper-rationality in a vacuum. There's too much clouding it, as you're pointing out. So yeah, I'm a pragmatist. This is like my wheelhouse.
Nice. Well, all right. I guess that's all I have to say for tonight. Anything else you want to add, Logos?
The big takeaway I got from this one, I think, is more than ever, I've now come to the realization that if you want to talk about Christianity and the whole view of what all these things are, it seems like a simple question, but your metaphysical view of creation, whether it's like an idealist view of creation, an ex materia view, an ex deo view, whatever you want, that view of creation, which seems like such a simple, detached question, seems to have ripple effects through the entire rest of the conversation that I don't think I would have seen coming until I saw Justin's model here and went, "Whoa, that's some weird stuff I never would have thought Christians believed." So that's something to think
Right.
about more.
Yeah, all right. Well, thank you, Logos. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.